My name is Lou Baxter. I was born December 4th, 1940, Mary Louise Van Dam. And my parents were Geraldine Stokes Van Dam and Norman Van Dam. I was born in San Diego, California in 1940. My older brother Norman was born in 1938, same hospital, Mercy Hospital in San Diego, and my older sister in January of 1940. So we were just 11 months apart, minus 3 days, and that seemed to be important to me growing up, that we weren't a year apart. We soon after moved to Honolulu, Hawaii. Dad was in the Marine Corps and was stationed at Pearl Harbor. Our quarters were at a place called Little Makalapa, which was junior officer housing up above the harbor of Pearl Harbor. At that time, well, maybe not quite yet, in December then of 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and we had black curtains on all of the windows in this housing area. So if you look at any old pictures, you see all this blackout stuff on the windows. Dad was was in supply, and he was sent out to the islands to check on supplies and Marines, so he was not on the island when it was bombed. And Mom's story is recorded, so I'm not going to repeat that. But we were on a list to send us back to the States, and evidently Mom kept taking her name off of the list because she was expecting my younger sister at that time and wanted to have her born in Hawaii and not in the middle of the ocean someplace. And so finally Dad got suspicious, and he asked the quartermaster how come we hadn't been shipped out. And he said, because your wife keeps taking her name off the list and putting it at the bottom. And by that time it was March, and Jerry was born in March 3rd, 1942. So then we were sent back on convoys of ships back to the mainland, and we landed at San Diego again. And the ship would have to zigzag to avoid submarines, or to try and be not hit by submarines. So I'm sure Mom had some harrowing tales to tell of having 4 little children on this ship going across the ocean. She couldn't find anyone who would rent her a home in San Diego or in the surrounding areas. She wanted to stay with Marine people, so she brought us back to Utah. Both Mom and Dad were from Utah, Mom from Draper and Dad from Murray. And she found a home to rent in what's called the Avenues of Salt Lake City. We were on L Street. And I was still very young, and I don't remember that at all. Dad came home while we were on L Street. The war was still going, but they had transferred him to San Francisco. And so we moved to San Mateo, just a little bit south of San Francisco. Our good friend Aunt Maida McMakin was living there with her 2 children, who were my age, and their daughter Nancy was between Gloria and Norm. And her husband was a Marine pilot, and he had gone missing. And she didn't want to stay alone, so she asked Mom and Dad to live with her. So we all lived together, and whenever they went to a school function, there would be lots of eyes looking at them, because there was 1 man and 2 ladies and all these children. But anyway, unfortunately, Ben McMakin died from his injuries in this crash, and they had escaped from Philippine captivity, but he died over there. And I was still very young. I must have been about 3, but it made a huge impression on my life that my dad was a Marine and could get killed doing what he did. So anyway, Maida went back to her family for a while and then eventually remarried. We moved on to Woodside, California. This was a fun place. This is clear up in the mountains above San Francisco and San Jose, and it was very wildflowers, rhododendrons, and great big pine trees, and lots of places for us to roam and play in the woods. And part of the time my Aunt Ellen came and stayed with Mom and lived with them and helped her with us. I do have memories of Woodside, and we played paper dolls out on the front porch, and it was a wooden porch and it had slats in it. So sometimes they would slide down through the slats, and whoever paper doll and stuff it was had to go down, and it was all spidery. We didn't like to do that. There my little sister would get in the dog foods dish, and I remember her mom scolding her for eating the dog food out of the dish. Mom was teaching Norm and Gloria to read at that time, and I remember that. And we had a black dog, a dachshund called Blackie, and so we lived there for about a year, and then we were transferred to Barstow, California. And someone either at Woodside or at Barstow made us girls buggies, doll buggies that were wooden, that were painted white. They were big, they were like this long, and they had this handle across the back. We could put all of our dolls in the buggy, and they had like toe painted flowers across the sides of them. They were just darling. And they'd made us matching bunk beds. So we had these white, it seemed like we all slept in one room and had these matching bunk beds and these doll buggies. And at one point we went on a parade in Redwood City, I think was the city by Woodside that where the kids went to school. I wasn't in school yet. And we went on a parade with these buggies and our hair all braided and white little pinafores on us. It was a fun memory. So then we moved to Barstow, and when we moved there, somebody had tied the huge weather balloons to each of our corners of our bunk beds to greet us in Barstow. So that was really fun. Barstow was just we actually were living at Yermo, which is the base right outside of Barstow, although Barstow was tiny at that time too. But we were out at Yermo on the base, and there was nothing there. They used to call it Barstow by the Sea. And so in the middle of this desert was this Marine base. Lots of Indians, Navajos would work on the base, and when something would clock or something would go off at 4 o'clock, and there'd just be a mass of Indians leaving the base. At Barstow, I had a birthday, and I guess Jerry, Sue, and I went around to every house on the base, which was not too many, and invited them to come to my birthday and to be sure and bring a present. And they all did. They thought, there was nothing to do there, and they thought, oh, we'll do that. That sounds like fun. And they knew that probably Mom had no idea what we were doing. Mom was pretty proper, always. And anyway, so they all came, and Mom had all these people streaming in the house telling me happy birthday. They all brought me a present. And she kept sending Dad out the back to get more cake and more ice cream to feed people. So that was kind of a funny memory that we have from there. Another memory we have is the doctor friend. We had a young doctor that came to Barstow. His His name was Dr. Forney, and he was single. And he loved coming to our home. Mom and Dad would always have dinner, and with the 4 of us children, there was always enough for one more, and he'd eat with us. And he came in a Jeep, which we thought was cool, and he was good friends. Well, one night he came, and our dog unfortunately had a habit of chasing cars, and it chased Dr. Forney's Jeep and got hit and killed. And he felt as bad as we did. That was a sad thing to have your dog killed. But anyway, then when we moved, well, for my birthday party, Dr. Forney gave me this little lamb, stuffed lamb, white, and it was the softest stuffed, I loved stuffed toys. I still love stuffed toys. It was the softest little stuffed toy that I had ever felt, and I absolutely loved it. But we moved that spring to Hawaii back again, and somehow the lamb didn't make it. But anyway, that was a favorite toy when I was young. I also had another favorite thing that couldn't make it, and that was the turtle, Pinky. And my girlfriend and I at the time had made a dollhouse together, and she got to keep the dollhouse because I couldn't take that. And Pinky, on the farewell party, I climbed up on my dad's boss's lap, General Creasy, and asked him if he would take care of my turtle for me. He was such a good sport. I'm not sure if they eventually had a daughter. I don't know if they had her then. But he said yes, he would take care of it, and he would write me letters and tell me how he was doing. So we went to Hawaii, and the quarters that they had assigned Dad were too small. They only had 3 bedrooms, and there were 4 children and Mom and Dad, and Mom soon was expecting our little brother. So they told Dad if he could find other quarters, they can use their housing allowance and live in civilian quarters. He happened to find an old plantation house that during the war was used as a nurse's quarters. It was on a place called McGrew Point, and it's right on the side if you go to visit the Arizona Monument. It's the land that's right alongside that monument. And the Navy owned it and had, like I said, it housed these nurses during the war in it. And it was huge, huge plantation lawns on it, and what do you call it? A whole like acre of flowering plants like plumeria trees and orchids and hibiscus and all of these flowering areas. In front of the home and to the side just a little, well, right in front of the home was this huge frog pond. We loved it. We caught tadpoles and great big frogs and constantly playing in the frog pond. But there was also a huge banyan tree. We loved the banyan tree. We climbed it. They have such large limbs that even our dog could get on the lower limb. We got another dog out there. His name was Patches and had a black fur around his one eye, so we named him Patches. And my understanding is you couldn't have taken dogs out there anyway, so probably was a blessing that we didn't have Blackie. Anyway, so we played. It was on the harbor. We had a big long raft that we would pull along the harbor and stab at jellyfish and find all kinds of treasures in the harbor. And when we weren't doing that, we would get on our bikes and we'd ride. I'm not sure if the sugarcane plantations were on the peninsula or if they were off, but we would ride to wherever the sugar cane was, and the men would be harvesting it, and there was always leftovers left from the harvest. So we'd go behind them and pick up pieces and suck on it, and we loved to suck on sugar cane. In Hawaii also, Mom and Dad hired a young couple to live with us. There was a maid's room, and we had Va and Sa and Leone. Leone and Va. Va was the son of the chief of, I'm not sure, I think it's Western Samoa. And he was going to the University of Hawaii getting his education. They had the baby Sa, and she was maybe 3 or 4 months when they came to live with us. Leone was still nursing her. And so Leone would help Mom with the house and with meals, and then Sa would go to school, and then when he'd come home, he would cut the lawns for Dad, and most fun for us, he would climb up the coconut trees and knock down a coconut and take his machete and whack it and split it open. I don't care for coconut juice, didn't then either, and he would let Norm liked it, he'd drink it, and then he'd crack the inner shell of the coconut and let us eat pieces of coconut, which we loved. We had mango and bananas and pineapple, all kinds of fruit on that land. We also had a pool, and Dad told the Marines that it needed to be fenced, that he did not want to be responsible for this pool. Dad loved to swim. He had been on the swim teams in Granite High in Salt Lake, and the captain of the swim team during his years at the University of Utah. So he taught us all how to swim, even Jerry Sue. And Dad and I would go swimming every morning before school. I guess the others didn't want to get up and do that, and Mom would braid my hair and we'd go off to school. One of the years I had a Hawaiian, a Chinese teacher, Mrs. Lang, and she was really nice. One thing I remember about the school, 2 things. One thing is I cheated on a math test. We had spiral notebooks, and on the back of them they had the times tables in chart. And my friend and I turned our books over and cheated, and sure enough she caught us and called us up. I've never been so embarrassed in my life. And I vowed right then I never was going to cheat again, and I never did. But I really learned my lesson. A fun thing about school in Hawaii, on May Day, they made big maypoles and taught us how to dance around a maypole and had big celebrations on May Day. We got to go to luau's in Hawaii and watch parades with King Kamehameha and representing Hawaiian history, and we didn't go to the beach very often. I don't remember going to the beach very often, and we don't have many pictures of that because we just lived at our pool. And we were in Brownie Scouts. Mom was our Brownie Scout leader, and both Gloria and I were in Brownie Scouts there. So we lived in Hawaii 2 years. Our little brother David was born there, and he was just little. He was born in February, and we probably moved in May, so he was just a few months old when we were transferred back to Quantico, Virginia. And we came in at San Francisco in a Mars plane, which is one that lands in the water. And I remember they made a bed for Mom in the front of the plane, and she stayed with the baby in the front of the plane. But I remember being in a plane that landed in the water. And then we went, every time we'd go across country, we would stop in Utah and meet our cousins and our grandma and grandpas, and have parties where everybody would get together. There were so many cousins, I just didn't remember any of them ever. Then we went to Quantico. We were only in Quantico 1 year, my 4th grade, and My memories of Quantico mostly were playing in the woods and at the pool. They had wonderful woods in Virginia, and we had this area that an old mining train or mining cars went along a track, and you could kind of ride in them and steer and get it going with this lever. And we spent hours down there in the gully playing with this car on the train tracks. Another fun memory of Quantico was that the LDS missionaries had a singing group that went up and down the East Coast. And Mom invited them all to dinner, so there were dozens of them. I don't know how many in this singing group, maybe 50 or something like that. And so she had made something to feed them, and she made biscuits, baking powder biscuits. Something went wrong with the baking powder biscuits, and they were harder than a rock. So these missionaries, are just young kids, and they just played catch and teased her about it and hit it with a baseball bat and just had more fun with these hard biscuits. So that was kind of a fun memory. The other one was playing bingo. The officers club would have activities for the officers and their families and wives, and they'd play bingo probably every week. Well, at some point we all went as a family, and I don't know if anybody else won that night, but every single one of us won. And the prizes, Mom told us all, get the sheets, and they had percal sheets as one of the prizes. So we went home with about 6 sets of new percal sheets, and Mom was so thrilled to have all of these new sheets. So that was a fun memory of Quantico. And then Dad was stationed in Washington, D.C., and they found housing in Centerville, Virginia. Centerville was just tiny at the time. I don't remember any stores. There was a gas station, and there was an elementary school. The older kids went into Manassas, I believe it was, for school. And so we all rode buses, and our home was on a road called Pickwick Road. That was just a fun name. We thought it sounded just as hillbilly as you could come. It's Pickwick Road. And it was red brick. It was a nice home. Dad brought home one of the first TVs then, a black and white TV, and we had another little dog at that. You couldn't take the dog from, well, maybe we do, because I think we have a picture of Patches in Quantico. Something must have happened to him though, because in Centerville we had another little puppy, and his name was, it was probably her name, was Patsy. And she was not house trained very well, and Mom would say, Patsy, whenever she would poop in the house. And so David called her Patsy Kiki. So we all called her Patsy Kiki. And it was that time too, probably, that Norman started, well, Jerry, I guess, called me, Mom and Dad called me Sweetie Pie. Jerry couldn't say Sweetie Pie, so she'd call me Petey Pie. I didn't like Petey Pie, so I said, just call me just plain Pete. So then they called me, quote, just plain Pete for quite a while, until finally it got dropped to Pete. And so I was called Pete when I was little, and Mary Lou by anyone else, except for family. While we were in Centerville, the church was, I don't know, it doesn't seem that far now, but it seemed like it was about 40 minutes away into Arlington Falls Church Ward. And we would go in there occasionally because the bishop was a good friend of Mom's and Dad's that they'd known in Utah. And we'd go to Sunday school. They had Sunday school in the morning and sacrament in the evenings. I don't remember ever going back in the evenings, but we would go to Sunday school, and then we'd go to, what's the name? lots of flavors, ice cream place. Can't think of the name of the ice cream store, and get what David would call a cream cone. So we'd go to Sunday school and stop by and get a cream cone and go home. And we didn't do that every Sunday, but we did go often enough that I can remember going. And Dad would take Norm, and if I can't remember when, maybe the last year Gloria was in what was called Mutual, and he would take Norm into Scouts and them into Mutual on a Tuesday night or whenever. While we were there, Dad was in supplies always, and it was the time, it was really before the Korean War. It was about 1950, 51, not sure when the Korean War started, but the Marines were over in Korea, and their feet were freezing, and they were getting frostbitten feet, and so Dad flew over to check on the boots, and so he left on a Friday morning, and David wasn't feeling very good, and so Mom took him to the airport and then went to Bethesda Naval Hospital where they had a clinic, and they diagnosed David with leukemia and put him immediately in the hospital, and the next day he was in a coma, and that was Saturday. Sunday he was still in a coma, and Sunday one of the Catholic priests stopped by and told Mom that asked her if he could give the last rites to David, and she said no, our missionaries had been by and they had given him a blessing and thanked him anyway, and he was not as sensitive as he could have been and said, well, you know he'll go to purgatory if you don't do this. And Mom was able to stand up to him and say, we don't believe that. We believe little children are perfect. And so then she came home really upset from the hospital and gathered us all around in our dining room and took down a Book of Mormon, and that's my first. I was in sixth grade. And that's my first memory of a Book of Mormon. I didn't really even know what it was, but she took it down and read to us out of Moroni that little children were perfect. And then the next day we went to school, and some of Mom's Marine friends had come to stay with her. And one of them picked us up from school, but we'd heard during recess time that our little brother had died. In fact, the children were teasing us. They had what was called party lines, where you had more than one family on a telephone line, and you picked up the phone when it rang, whatever number your household was, 1 or 2, 3 rings, whatever it was, and they'd have 5 or 6 families on this party line. And of course some women could not resist but listening in on other people's conversations, and somebody had listened in and heard that David had died and called the school and told them before Mom had a chance to send someone over to pick us up and get us out of school. But they did come over and pick us up, and one of our Marine friends, Uncle Don Decker, took us for a long walk in the woods. And I remember how kind that was. Sorry. And I remember Gloria was just screaming on the bed, and it was really upsetting Mom. And she didn't stop. He couldn't get her to go with us, but he took the rest of us. Not sure who had David, but he took me and Jerry, Sue, and Norman for a long walk in the woods. And we were used to playing in the woods and used to swinging on vines and swinging from one. They still had like the hills from the Civil War, in those woods. And so when David died, the Marines immediately caught Dad midair, actually, and he never did get to Korea. They stopped him at some place along the way and told him what had happened. David hadn't died then, he was in a coma, and had him fly back. He didn't get back until after David had died, but he did fly right back before he even got to Korea. And the Marine people were we weren't on base. None of them lived by us. The nearest ones lived 30 minutes away in Manassas or Fairfax or up in Arlington and even into DC and Maryland. And they really rallied around Mom, and of course she knew the bishop, and so they were very close to him and very good to us. One Marine friend took Norm on his paper route for 2 weeks at that time. So they just really rallied around us. One other traumatic, so David was buried at Arlington National, and if he hadn't have been, Mom and Dad probably wouldn't be buried there today, because now it's too crowded and they don't have veterans buried there. But since they already had the plot, then both Mom and Dad are buried with him. So that's been a nice thing for our family to have them all there. Another traumatic thing happened. My best friend was named Joyce Harlow with an H, and she was Methodist, so whenever we didn't go to our church, she'd invite me and I'd go with her to the Methodist church. And they had a fun Sunday school. We sang Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, For the Bible Tells Me So, and I learned Methodist Sunday school songs. Their teacher knew Bible stories, so that's kind of where I got my love for Bible stories and learned all the stories in Genesis. And but at any rate, so this was in when we were in 8th grade, but Joyce got the flu and went blind from it. So that was another traumatic thing. None of us knew you could die and get blind from illnesses, but this was happening to us this year. And so Joyce couldn't come to school. She couldn't see. And she got over the flu, but she still couldn't see. So we all would go over and play with her and visit with her, and the neighborhood kids, and we all got together and bought her a record player and some records, and it was just an awful thing to happen to someone our age. And eventually, she missed all of the rest of that year, but eventually her sight came back to her, and she was able to see again and was fine. But that was another traumatic thing. So Dad put in for a transfer, and he was transferred down to Camp Lejeune. No one wanted to stay in the house without David. So we moved down to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. It was on the coast, gorgeous beaches, wonderful surf, great big sand dunes. Dad would reserve the beach cottage. They had cottages built right on the beach, right on the surf, and right on the sand dunes. And Dad reserved them in the winter as well as occasionally in the summer, but other people wanted them in the summer. But we'd go in the winter and just play ball on the beach and run up and down the sand dunes and go to sleep listening to the water, and just loved the beach there. My best friends were Mary Ellen Page, a general's daughter, and then Ellie Speckman. And Mary Ellen was Episcopalian, and Ellie was Catholic, and we'd take turns going to each other's churches together so that we could all go to church together on the weekends. Except that Ellie couldn't go to ours. She could only go to hers. But Mary Ellen and I would go to the Catholic Mass. It was all in Latin at that time, so we got nothing out of it, but we'd go. And then the next week we'd go to Episcopalian with Mary Ellen, which was quite similar. It was all in Latin also. and quite similar as far as I could see to the Catholic one. And then Mary Ellen occasionally would come out to ours. Ours branch was in Jacksonville, the little town off the base, and it was a dance hall, and we'd clean up after the dance hall and move the jukebox out of the way, and there were little rafters across the ceiling, and sometimes we'd be sitting in a church and you'd see little mice running across the rafters in the ceiling, and it was just a tiny branch, and they had, if you were 12 and over, you went with adults, and under 12 went with the children. And there were maybe half a dozen children and maybe 12, 15, 20 adults. And so I was 12, so I went in with the adults and went to Gospel Doctrine Sunday school. It was called, they were teaching A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, LeGrand Richards' book. Our teacher was a teenage girl, Peggy, and she gave us the Joseph Smith story. I hadn't heard that before, and boy, I just took that to heart. She challenged us to go home and pray about it, and I did, and had an amazing experience in the night, and then have ever since known that the church was true and that God was real and that Joseph Smith was a prophet. So that was a really critical time in Camp Lejeune for me. Mom and Dad did a lot of entertaining on the base, and they had a liquor cabinet in the dining room, and Mom had told us a little bit about the LDS belief about word of wisdom, and that we weren't supposed to drink alcohol or have tobacco in any form, not cigarettes, and Dad was a chain smoker of cigars ever since the war. And at that time, Mom would kind of go back and forth. At that time, she was kind of doing some social drinking to try and be companionable with Dad, and but he took us all in the dining room and showed us the liquor cabinet and said, if you want liquor, it's right here. He said, I don't want you going behind my back and drinking. If you want liquor, you come to me and I'll give it to you. And he said the same on cigarettes. He said, if you want cigarettes, I'll buy you some and you can smoke in front of me. I guess, you know, you see pictures of people spluttering when they first start smoking. That probably didn't appeal to us. However, you know, for some reason, I took that to heart and I never experimented, even though lots of pressure from kids every day on the bus. Evidently, in talking with my brothers and sisters, they all tried it, and then fortunately none of us ended up smoking or drinking. But at any rate, that was a critical decision at those times, because we would go to the movie every weekend. My mom and Dad would say, well, what's playing? And we'd say, we don't know, but it's a good one. And they would let us go, and we'd hop on the bus, and they'd take us down to the base theater. Camp Lejeune's a big Marine base, I think next to Pendleton, one of the biggest. And so you had to ride the bus to the pool and to the school and to the theater. And so we spent a lot of time at movies. During free time, I would go with Mary Ellen. I think Ellie didn't live quite that close to us, because most of the time I remember playing with Mary Ellen, and the Camp Lejeune's on the James River in North Carolina. On the beaches are on the ocean, but the James River goes on one side of the base, and we would play along the river, and we just spent almost every afternoon after school and weekends on the river. So I was there 7th and 8th grade. We played a lot of basketball in Camp Lejeune. Gloria was able to be in 9th grade on the team, and I just wanted to be on the team, and wasn't quite old enough, had to wait till the next year, but we played basketball all the time, and that's where my name was changed. I used to play with a guy called Buster Frates. That wasn't his real name, that was his nickname. He later, I read somewhere a few years ago, was commandant in the Marine Corps. So I guess he stayed, went into the service career like his dad. But anyway, he went to pass me the ball at school one day during recess and said, "I can't say Mary Lou, that takes too long, I'm just going to call you Lou." And from then on I've been called Lou, except for some of my aunts in Utah still call me Mary Lou occasionally. So, so from there we went to out to Utah for a year. Dad was sent to Japan during the Korean War, and Mom decided to take us all and go to Utah. We lived in a wonderful place. We lived in Garden Park Ward area between 9th and 11th East and something like 9th and 11th South. And Garden Park Ward was a gorgeous ward with a beautiful pond and swans in it in the back, and beautiful ward building. And I went to Roosevelt Junior High. I did not like Utah. Everything was so traditional. You had to wear Joyce shoes, you had to wear cashmere sweaters, and you had to, I had to ride a road show in PE. I was excellent in PE. I knew how to play basketball. I knew how to swim. But to ride a road show for PE, I didn't have any idea what a road show was. And it bothered me because I wanted to get A's in everything. And I did not know how to do that. And their explanations, never having seen one, I didn't know what they were talking about. So I didn't care for that 9th grade in Utah. No one in the ward ever invited me to their homes. I liked the ward. We had wonderful adult teachers who were real kind and very sharp, good teachers. Our young men were in junior MN basketball at that time, and they took the church championship, and we'd go and cheer them on. That ward had all kinds of general authorities living in it, Elder Sill, Richard L. Evans, LeGrand Richards, Brother Benyon, I don't know how many others. And so they'd be in and out of meetings, and their sons were on this basketball team, and we had a lot of fun at group activities. But I made friends at seminary and at school with other kids, and they only lived a few blocks away, so that was fine. I would go to their homes. So then after Utah, Dad came back from Japan. He wasn't in, quote, the war. He was in administration of supplies, and he was based at Yokosuka, Japan. And incidentally, years later, my husband was on the same base and was going to church and would have met Dad if Dad had been going. But anyway, so then we were transferred to Maryland, and Dad went to the War College and then worked at the Pentagon. And so they found a home. They told us we could choose this home. They had always chosen the homes. We found a home in Northern Virginia that we really liked. And then Mom checked into the school district, and she didn't like the schools there. And they heard that the Marines were passing down a home to rent in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And it was something like $110 a month, which even then was a good price for the DC area. And it was a block away from the Chevy Chase LDS ward. So there went our choice on the home. And actually, we liked it. We liked Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, and we liked being that close to the ward. And we got very involved. We'd gotten involved in Utah in the church, and gone to seminary, and liked that. And back in Maryland, they hadn't had seminary, but on I think it was my senior year, they started seminary. We had a brother Ellsworth that would come over from Northern Virginia. I think he had to leave home at 5 to get across the bridges and get into Maryland, and he was working for the FBI, and get back to work on time. So he would come over, and he was a marvelous teacher. He just was a fireball of a teacher. And he got us all excited about it. We had a good group of young people in that ward. And we were used to a good ward at Garden Park in Salt Lake, and so it was fun to go to a big ward at Chevy Chase and have lots of young people and golden green balls. There weren't any active LDS boys in our school. There were 2,200 kids in our high school at Bethesda Chevy Chase, and about 8 of us were LDS. And I went to school with my brother was a senior when I was a sophomore. Gloria was a junior, and then Jerry went to the junior high. And so there were the 3 of us, and then a couple boys that were inactive, and a couple girls that were active. So one of my best friends, Nancy Dyer, the granddaughter of LeGrand Richards, was active in the church, and she went to BCC. My best friend, Diane Wilkinson, was LDS, and she didn't live anywhere near us. I can't even remember how far away she did live. But they switched, and on our senior year, they built a new high school, and Diane was pulled into the new high school. But she got to be a cheerleader. She had a fun senior year, so it took the edge off her being into a new school on her senior year. So, but I was very active in activities in high school. I got good grades, and I was choir chaplain the first year and vice president the second 2 years, and real active, beautiful choir. Our instructor took us all over for contests at Catholic University and University of Maryland, and we sang in the National Cathedral, and choir was just a real big part of our lives, and journalism began to be a part of my life. I wrote for the school newspaper, and English came easily to me, and they asked me to be the editor for their school handbook, where they listed all the clubs, the school rules and traditions and whatever. So I had a committee, and we spent my summer between my junior and senior year working on that, and had friends to this day from that association. And so high school was a lot of fun. I still go back to their reunions. I'm the only one in my family that had such a good experience in high school, and can go back to the reunions. So from there, Dad had a choice. He could take an assignment at France or Puerto Rico. Gloria and I definitely voted for France. We thought that sounded exciting. But knowing all the entertainment, Dad's drinking was a problem to him, and they had kind of wanted to be married in the temple, and he could not get on top of that. He quit his smoking cold turkey in Maryland. Our bishop was a medical doctor, and the cancer scare came out associated with tobacco, and Daddy thought he didn't want to get cancer, and he just quit cold turkey. And Bishop Telford told him that if you can quit that, it's harder to quit tobacco than alcohol. You can quit alcohol, but he couldn't seem to, and it began to be quite a problem to the family for him to be drinking as much as he was. So it ruined a lot of holidays, and we have some sad experiences. He never got violent or rough with us, but argumentative and kind of ruined the spirit of holidays during that time. But he chose Puerto Rico because there was less entertaining and it was more informal, and he liked to swim. And so we packed up and took a ship down to Puerto Rico the first time. So there were the 3 girls. Norm had chosen to go on a mission, went to Brazil on his mission from Maryland. And one thing that happened in Maryland is I wrecked Norm's car. He let me drive his car while he was away. He'd gone into the service before his mission. So I had graduated from Bethesda Chevy Chase with high honors, got a scholarship to several places, to Northwestern University in Chicago and also to BYU. And Gloria and Norm had both had good experiences at BYU and Provo, and so I chose to go to BYU, which has probably been a wonderful choice for me to have made at that time. And then we packed up and took a ship, took 3 days to go on Navy transport down to Puerto Rico, and got quarters. Dad, they chose quarters for Dad, or he chose them, right next to the officers club and pool. So we were right across the street from the pool. They had Christmas lights all around the outside, so it was pretty. My bedroom looked right over the pool, and I had these pretty Christmas lights that I could look out onto all night. It was funny, as we got off the ship and we'd go upstairs in these concrete homes that they had in Puerto Rico in the quarters, and you'd feel like you were leaning to the side until you got your sea legs taken care of. It was just funny after being on a ship that long. None of us kids had been on a ship that long, or a Navy transport ship, and so that was kind of a funny experience for us. So we went to Puerto Rico, and we were just there in the summer, and we'd hoped to work, and the Puerto Ricans felt like our dad was a colonel, and actually he was commanding officer of the Marines in the Caribbean, so he probably did have a good income, and they would not hire us at any of the, we tried all kinds of places, grocery stores and secretarial and all kinds of places. They'd already given out all the slots on the bases. They had several bases in San Juan. They had the Navy base that we lived on, and then they had an Army base. The second summer we were there, I got a job working. Dad helped get us jobs, and got a job for me at the Army base PX, BX, I think they call them on base exchanges in Army. And Gloria worked in the office at the PX on the naval base where we lived. And we just had a wonderful time in Puerto Rico during the summers. I dated a Puerto Rican guy there. I'm not sure how he got on the base, but met him at the pool and started dating, did a couple little things with him, and quite liked him. But after a while, we were invited by some officers at the bachelor's officers' quarters to go to some of the cocktail parties with them, and I met a young officer named Jay Quick. He was a lieutenant when I met him, and he was 10 years older. He actually was married and separated. I was very naive, didn't know the difference between separation and divorce, and I don't remember my parents really emphasizing that, although my dad did call him in one time and talked to him pretty plainly, I guess, about it. But we still dated. He just treated me royally, took me out to dinners at the bases, and we'd have steak and lobster and swim at the various beaches, and the Marines always had the best beaches so that they could do their maneuvers on them. And we'd go snorkeling. Puerto Rico was just a fun time. That first summer, when we didn't have any jobs, we got very restless. We went to a tile company, and I made a tabletop out of ceramic tiles, and I guess just read a lot and went to the pool a lot because there was nothing else to do that first summer. And then I came out to BYU. One thing Gloria got me doing during the summer that we hadn't done before was exercising. And she said, Lou, everybody gains weight at the Y. They have all these casseroles, and they're cheap to fix and to feed everybody. And I was going to be rooming in the same dorm as she was, with the same apartment, with her as my roommate in the same bedroom. And so she got me exercising every morning that year. And so we'd do that and then go to the pool or whatever we were doing, the beach. So we did do that before we came. We also applied for the University of London. That sounded kind of exotic to me, and I thought, oh, I'm not sure I want to go out to Provo. Let's try London. But I wanted interior design, and that's way too fluffy for the British. They wanted STEM subjects, science or math or things like that. So we didn't get accepted into the University of London, and I did come out to BYU, and the first night we got out, we had to fly out on a plane because Gloria was in charge of orientation for freshmen, and so she had to be there a couple days early, and it didn't match with the ship's schedule, so the Marines paid to fly us to New York, and we somehow got from there down to DC and drove out with some other kids from Maryland that we knew were driving and had made arrangements ahead of time that first summer. But the first night we got out there, a Marine friend of Mom's picked us up at the airport and brought us down to Provo, picked up our chests that had all of our belongings in. But you really weren't supposed to be in the dorms. The electricity wasn't turned on, or the water was on, but not the electricity. So everything was dark. And we were up on the 3rd floor apartment. And I remember looking out over campus, and it was so dark. And Puerto Rico seemed like eons away, and it was my one night of real homesickness. I'd been dating Jay, and he was clear out in Puerto Rico, and I thought, what am I doing here? But anyway, we got involved in school the next day, and she got me helping with orientation and being oriented to school, and I pushed hard with schooling and did well with my classes, got writing for the BYU newspaper, and soon had a byline, which was an important thing in journalism and writing for the newspaper. And my second year, I went all that summer because we went home that summer we didn't go home at Christmas. That first summer we went up, and Gloria and I stayed in Grandma Stokes' house. Grandma was going to one of the kids, and it was going to be empty, so we stayed at Grandma's. Mom and Dad sent us $25 in a conch shell for Christmas, and we went out and bought material and used Grandma's sewing machine, made us some school clothes. And then the second summer we stayed in Provo, and I went to school because Gloria had started dating Bob Hampson and was engaged and getting married that June. And I actually that February had broken off over Christmas with Jay Quick and by mail, and started dating Clint Baxter, I guess I'd written home. I was dating another guy, I can't remember his name, and he wanted me to go home and meet his parents. He lived in somewhere between Salt Lake and Provo, and I declined, because usually when guys wanted to take you home to meet their families, they were getting serious, and I wasn't that serious about him. And I guess the very next letter I wrote home to Mom and Dad was, I had told them this incident, and then I said, but I'm dating Clint Baxter, and he wanted me to go home and meet his family, and so I went home this weekend and met his family. So then Mom and Dad were all worried, well, is this serious? And it actually was. After meeting Clint, we dated each other exclusively from February on, and he wanted to get married at least by fall. And I felt real strongly, particularly when Aunt Maida's husband was killed, I just felt like a woman had to have some kind of training and education degree that she could fall back on with schooling. And I was afraid I'd get pregnant and not finish my schooling, and I wouldn't get married until Christmas. And Mom and Dad came out for Gloria's wedding, but they couldn't go through the temple. That was hard on them. So when we got engaged in July, and then when we told them we wanted to get married in December, our bishop thought sure they would come. He said, you just wait, they'll come. But they didn't. They went to Panama on a trip and didn't feel like they could afford to come clear out to Utah. But I think the real reason was they couldn't go through the temple, and it was just hard for them. So Grandma Stokes went to the temple with me. Grandpa died when we were in high school. And couple of Clint's sisters were married in the temple, Cleone and Labrie and their husbands, and they went to the temple with us. And actually, I'm not sure, maybe Labrie hadn't gone through the temple then, maybe just Cleone and Grandma and Aunt Ellen and Uncle Bob. And Aunt Ellen and Uncle Bob had offered to let me make my wedding dress at their home. And so when I could come up during the weekends, I'd get my dress made, and I just felt bad. I felt like I was imposing on Ellen, and I didn't want her to have to do a whole reception when her kids were just young. And so I made arrangements with a reception center and just billed Dad for it. And I think Ellen and Clint's mom, or maybe just Ellen, made the centerpieces for the tables or something. And Clint's sister, Cleone, took a video of our wedding, which was nice. I still have it today and have digitized it to DVD so that we can watch it. And so then we had a full year of, no, not a full year. We had from January through August. No, we had more than that. We had that rest of that semester through June, and then we came up to Taylorsville and lived in a little granny house. Hofflings had a little granny house on 48th South, down from Clint's home in Taylorsville, and we rented that from them. It was about as big as this living room. It had a little kitchen and a little bedroom, enough for, I don't even know if it was a double bed, and a curtain into a bathroom and a little closet, and we lived there for the summer. Clint did sheet metal work. Very rough environment, awful language among the men. And we didn't have a phone in this little house, and one night he had to do a double shift. I wasn't used to shift work, didn't know what a double shift was, but he didn't come home that night, and I knew it was payday, and I cried the entire night. I was pregnant with Scott. I thought, sure, Daddy had been mugged, robbed, beaten to death, and that I was going to be a widow with a baby on the way. Well, first thing is it got light. Sister Hoffling ran over and knocked on my door and said, your husband's on the phone and wants to talk to you. And so he apologized. He couldn't reach me before because we didn't have a phone, and he was fine, and he had just had to work a double shift. So anyway, we finished that summer there. I had tried to find a job, and I was so big and pregnant, I guess everybody thought that my baby was going to come any day and they would not hire me anywhere. And I think Clint's folks were real disappointed that I wasn't working, but I certainly walked my feet off going job hunting. So he worked there for the summer, and then we went back to school for that whole year through the following August. And I was done except for 2 night classes. So Scott was born October 7th, and I was still taking 2 night classes. I had a magazine article writing class and another class, and finished those up, and then had all the classes I needed for my degree, and just stayed home with Scott and took care of him, and I was nursing him, and Mom and Dad had retired and come to Provo, so Mom came over and helped me when I first got home from the hospital. Had a horrible 3-day labor with Scott. Thought I was going to die for sure. But Mom came over and helped me and showed me how to bathe a baby and take care of a baby. I was not at all used to babies. I had babysat a little bit in high school, but no babies. And anyway, so we learned on Scott, and then Clint graduated. We both graduated and decided to go to graduation and walk across the stage, get our degrees in August. And then he was able to get a coaching job in Tinnick High School. And we went up there. He had this old Ford car, and it was a steep hill to get up to Tinnick. And Tinnick's other name is Eureka, and it was the Tinnick Mine, and so some people called it Tinnick, and the high school was called Tinnick High School, and it vied with Taviona for the smallest in the state. So anytime you were playing anybody, they were much bigger and usually won. But anyway, the car would heat up going up that hill every time, and we'd be over to the side of the road waiting for it to cool down, and trying to add water into it to cool it down. And so as soon as we could, after he got his job and a steady income coming in, we bought us a station wagon. And Dad Baxter was so good. He paid for it and let us pay him, so we didn't have any interest. And we paid him religiously. We were very honest in paying him back every cent of that. And I think he appreciated that because he had some financial help out to one of the other kids who was not so faithful in repaying him, but he appreciated us being that faithful in paying our bills. So Clint taught at Tinnick and various subjects and coached, and then worked that summer at not a silver mine, I think it was clay or something they were mining at that time. Tinnick was famous for silver mines, but I think there was no silver left. And but here again it was shift work and very rough environment. It paid much better than school teaching, but I felt like he was the only one in his family that had gone to college and gotten a degree, and that we ought to use it, and the money was not that important to me. I felt like it was better for him to be in a better environment and teaching and doing what his education had trained him to do, and he loved coaching. He was excellent working with boys. He just really was good in explaining skills to boys. And so we moved, he applied, we drove all over California, I thought, applying for a job. And I found out later that he hadn't even taken a resume with him. That he did not want to live in California, that it was all just a ploy to satisfy me that he had tried and couldn't get a job. And we didn't. And he got a job out in Vernal, Utah, eastern Utah, dinosaur land, and we rented for several years out there, and then were able to build a home on 3rd North and 6th West, and it was a nice home. It was solid, and it didn't have a garage. We missed not having a garage in that cold weather, but we couldn't afford. We had to choose between a carport or a full basement. We could have half a basement and a carport, or a full basement, and we thought surely somewhere along the line we'll be able to save up enough money for a garage. But we got a full basement, and eventually were able to finish that off so that the boys could sleep down there, and we could have a nice sized family room down there. And lived in Vernal, and it was in an area where other young families were just starting out too, and so we all raised our kids together, and the kids all grew up having friends their age, and big active ward, and we both had various callings, and Daddy served on an Indian mission right away. The contractor was in the presidency of the Indian mission, and Daddy was coaching over on the reservation at West Junior High, and had half Indian, half white students. And so they called him on the Indian mission for 2 years. It was considered a full-time mission, although he'd get up and leave by about 7:30, I think, and drive over in a carpool to school. And then, except when he was coaching, he had to drive because he had to stay late, and then with the mission he had to drive anyways because he had to go from school to the mission, and they were both Fort Duchesne and Randalet, both branches were over on the west side, over by the junior high and elementary school over there. So we were only a block from the high school and from Vernal High, and the junior high was fairly close. The elementary school was just right across from the high school, so it actually was probably two and a half blocks up from where we lived. So the kids walked to school, much to their dismay in the winter, and I stayed home and took care of the preschoolers, and occasionally had another preschooler that I would tend for somebody who was working. And so eventually, after his mission, Clint was having jobs in the ward, and then right before we left Vernal, he was called as Bishop of Vernal 6th Ward, and then he was bishop of that ward for 2 years, and I had been serving in the, actually before that, I was serving in the Young Women's, and I loved leaving everybody at home. I could go off and teach Young Women's and just take my books and my supplies for my lesson. I absolutely loved that. All the other times I would take everybody and bundle everybody up, and most of the times at first I'd have to get a ride to go to Relief Society or primary or wherever. and wait till he got home and try and run and go grocery shopping at night. And loved teaching young women. But then he got called in as assistant state clerk, and it was on Tuesday nights. He had to meet with the stake. And so he asked me to be released because he felt like one of us needed to be home with the children, which was probably I cried my heart out, but it was probably a very wise decision. I remember our bishop's wife coming, and she just pleaded, Ellen Galley, if I wouldn't still teach her daughter in Maya Maids. And she would come over and stay with the kids at night, and she would be good with them, and they had 7 children, I think. And I said, no, Clint thinks I need to be home, and so I need to be released. And she was so sad, and actually her daughter married out of the church, and I just felt sad about that later. I thought, oh, maybe if I'd taught her longer, maybe we could have helped her build her testimony. But anyway, that didn't happen, and I stayed home and got called into primary or something I could take children with, and served in other callings there, stake primary, stake relief society. So he was bishop for 2 years, and I guess I was in the relief society presidency is what they called me to do, because we would go around and visit, and I had to be really careful and not tell him anything we discussed and let it just be between the relief society president and the bishop. And I wouldn't tell her anything if he happened to slip, which he didn't do very often, of anything that was happening in the ward. I made sure I didn't mention it to anyone I was serving with. And then we were watching a wrestling meet of Ron's, a wrestle off actually, not even a meet, and the stake had called us in to meet with us. And Clint says, well, what do you think they're going to call us to? He said, I've only been bishop 2 years. And I thought, oh, it's probably got something to do with me. All this time he'd been meeting with the stake presidency, and they were forming a new ward in Vernal, and he knew all about it because he'd been meeting with them for months, and about who to take, and he was pulling the whole back road of our block with him because it was his priesthood leaders, and our boys were in young men's, and he wanted some consistency with them. And this new ward had very few youth, maybe 8 or 10 youth, and our ward had been huge because all of us had raised our kids together. So anyway, we found out that they were going to form a new ward. We were moving, not the house, just walking downtown, and it was like 6 blocks or 8 down to the ward. Then we need to build a new ward, which we did, and that was an excellent opportunity. It really was a good opportunity, all of it. It just was hard, and the kids' friends were in our old ward, all of them, and I would put the kids, the little ones, on the stroller, and one in the seat, and the 2 of them on the back, and the rest would walk all the way down to Vernal, first and second ward. I think we went to, not second, first and something ward that we went to for a while we built our new ward. Took 2 years to build the new ward, and then it was Vernal 9th Ward. And it's interesting because now, after numerous boundary changes and everything, our area of where our old home is back in that same ward building, and they all go back to the whole ward that we had in Vernal 6th Ward goes down to Vernal 9th Ward now. So Lori asked me to share a memory of each child, and so some of them are when they're little and some are older. So I'll start with Rex. So one memory I have with Rex is the older boys needed to have surgery at St. Mark's Hospital in Salt Lake, and Rex was my only one not in school, so I took him with me and kept him with me for, actually it ended up being 2 weeks, and I'd come home during the weekend. So Rex and I slept at Darrell and Hank Hoole's, and then would spend the entire day at St. Mark's Hospital. And this was about 1977, so he was about 4 years old, a little boy. And occasionally we'd have lunch at Aunt Maureen's because she was taking care of Grandma Stokes then. And one lunch I remember Grandma was eating some kind of cooked cabbage or something, and she offered some to Rex, and he said no, he didn't like that. And he and I were eating yogurt, and so he offered her some of his yogurt. And no, she didn't want yogurt. So that was kind of a fun memory of him with Grandma Stokes. And during the hospital, then he and I would mostly play the matching game. And we'd match animal mamas to their babies. And he could beat me at that age even. But he wouldn't get restless. I would take some toys and other games that we could play while we could visit with the older boys. And he was such a good little companion. He was just excellent. On Lori, the one memory I especially have is that was in high school actually. She was such a loyal friend. She was even though she was a cheerleader and a popular girl, she still stayed close with her ward friends, Scott Wood, Matt West, Julie Shepard, Talina Trimble. I don't know if there were some others, but she was always hanging out with them and doing things with them, and not snobbish because she was a cheerleader at all. I remember when Shauna was about 3 or 4 years old, I had a bottom drawer that I kept for the toddling babies that had Tupperware and some plastic toys in it. And she would stand there and play with those little plastic dishes and sing for hours. She would play cooking and mama stuff and just sing all day long. I guess probably primary songs. Gaylin is an older memory too. I think one of the main memories I have of Gaylin is when we moved here, when we took her in for an athletic physical. She wanted to play volleyball at South. They discovered her scoliosis, and it was severe enough that she needed to wear a brace over a complete torso, and she couldn't fit her jeans over it. So here she was, a young teen, and had to wear this brace. I had to make her homemade jeans that she had to wear to school all the time. And she was so self-conscious about it. It was awful in PE. But she still wore it almost the entire year, and did her exercises. Right before the year was up, she took off the brace and had had enough. So even though she hated it and it was embarrassing to her and awkward, I just have this memory of the diligence and obedience that she had doing that health thing. Ron, I remember a little incident when he was in 2nd grade. I think he had Mrs. Williams at Ashley Elementary, and she had done a leather unit with the children at school, and he had made a leather wallet and tooled it. And he was so excited when he brought it home, and Clint didn't come home for hours yet, and he wanted to show it to Clint. By the time Clint came home, he couldn't find it. He didn't know where he'd put it, and he was almost in tears. Excuse me. And he came up a little while later and said he had had a prayer, and he'd found his wallet and could show it to Clint, and he was so pleased, and Clint was proud of him for making it. Another little quick memory of Ron was when he wrestled off when he was in 9th grade with Josh Reynolds. Every time they'd come to a wrestling meet, it seemed like he'd have to wrestle off with Josh Reynolds. And most of the time, Ron was able to beat him. They were about the same size and strength and agility. But I remember him every time getting tense because he was having to wrestle off with Josh Reynolds. But I remember him beating him most of the time. Scott, I have a memory when he was in 7th or 8th grade. I had taught all of the children piano as they were younger, and then I don't know what grade, but maybe 5th, 6th grade, he wanted to quit, and so we let the boys quit piano. But when he got in 7th and 8th grade, he had a male music teacher. Everybody had to take this general music class. And this male teacher could play jazz and was so fun. Scott thought he was just the funnest teacher he'd ever had. And he came home and asked if he could take piano again and could he just learn jazz. So I called Levon Larson, the teacher I had was taking while I was carrying Lori. And she said yes, she could help him just learn jazz. And so he took for the, I don't know how many months, maybe only 6 months or so, until the district fired that teacher. I guess they didn't think he had good enough discipline. But that was kind of a fun memory with Scott. So I think we stopped in 1979. So in 1979, in the spring, April I believe, Clint was released as bishop. And shortly after, he received a letter from the school district saying they were releasing all counselors in the district. They had to keep on their head person. But they offered him a position as generalist in special ed, or special ed. And that was not what he wanted to do. He just barely earned his master's. And so he came out to Ogden looking for positions, and there were 2. And he received a position at South Junior High in South Ogden. And I was in the middle of that day. It was like a Saturday, and I was at a conference for color coding for Stake Relief Society. And he called me when I went home for lunch and said, I need you to go right downtown and get a for sale sign and put it on the lawn. We don't have time to sell our home. And so I did. I just ran downtown, grabbed a for sale sign, and then went back to my conference. And here all the kids came home. One of the biggest mistakes of our parenting was the kids all came home and saw this for sale sign, and we'd not even talked to them about the letter or him going out to Ogden to look for other jobs and possibly moving. None of that had we talked with them. So we couldn't sell. The interest rates were 18%, and Clint came out, had to be at school in a couple weeks earlier in August, and he stayed with Ellen and Bob while he began his 2 weeks ahead of the school schedule. So I needed to pack up the house and move, and Ellen and Bob offered their Huntsville home for us to stay in until we could find a place to rent. And I couldn't find any place for anybody would rent to me with 6 children. So the home we wanted was on Ben Lomond Avenue, and it was owned by Mabel and Tom Draper, and their son was a realtor, and he did what was called creative financing and set it up that we could pay rent payments, and they, fortunately for us, put those on the principal and set it up to have us give him a balloon payment when we sold. And it took 2 years, so that was a long time for them to wait. And then their parents could move to a condo where they could handle the single floor. That next year, Scott was called on his mission to Dallas, and when he was called, the church had a 15-month mission and was trying that out. And both boys had timbered and saved up their money for their missions, and especially with the move, but even so, we didn't have savings to pay for missions. And and so while Scott was on his mission, it got extended back to the 2 year. So he didn't have those extra 6 months, and called us and asked us if we could maintain him for 6 months. We, of course, told him yes. We weren't quite sure how, but we didn't tell him that. But I had an insurance policy that we turned in and cashed, and then I started teaching part-time for Weber State. They had a continuing ed, and I took assignments such as helping women in Ogden City budget and working with Vietnamese and Laotian women, learning how to use refrigeration and diapering babies and that. It was very interesting for me. I enjoyed it. And did lunch and learns at IRS and other companies, doing things like making French bread and Christmas goodies and little skills that I knew how to do while they were eating their lunch. Then I also started substitute teaching. I'd done some substitute teaching out in Vernal when Clint was bishop. And so I did substitute teaching at the high school and the junior high and the elementary. And we were able to keep him out for the 6 months. Soon after his wedding, Galen got married, and we had her wedding, and then Shauna's wedding at the church, at the reception. They were both married in the temple. And then Ron was married and had his reception at our home. And then Lori's wedding at the Salt Lake Temple, and had the reception at the church. So those were busy years. And in 1990, I went back. I was doing still some substitute teaching and applied to the University of Utah for a Master's of Science in Ed Psych, and received it in 1990. It actually took 2 years, so I started in 88, just about a year after Ron came home from his mission. And so I went into school counseling. I got a job in school counseling when I just had 1 year of my master's done, because they needed one in Ogden City. So my first job was at Highland Middle School, and we learned nothing about registering students on the computer at the U. And this was the first year that Ogden City had done that, and it was a real mess. I enjoyed counseling the kids and the parents. And then the second year that I counseled at 3 elementaries in Ogden City. And I also at that time was called as Relief Society president, so that was a busy time in my life. In 1993, Rex fell rock climbing in the summer, and I was babysitting for Danny Reed. Shauna and Scott had taken Brittany down to the Manti Temple pageant, and I was tending Danny and got a call from the hospital saying Rex had been brought in from a rock fall. And so I was just feeding him, and just grabbed his food and his bottle and Clint, and we went to the hospital, to McKD, and then Sister Goddard came and picked him up and kept him until I got out of the hospital and could keep him until, actually I slept at the hospital. Somebody came and picked him up and kept him until Shauna got home. In 1994, my father died, and we flew back to Washington, D.C., went down to Oceanside for the funeral there, and then flew back to Washington, D.C. for the burial at Arlington Cemetery. From about 1995 to the present, actually, although I stopped in 2009 for a while, Clint and I did senior games, and he was doing a lot of field events and running, and I thought I could swim. He was also biking at that time, and so I would just sign up to swim the mile, and I was pretty successful in that. And then I would get bored at the track watching him do all his events, and so I started running and began running the 400 and the 800 and the mile and doing 5Ks. So we did that to 2009, and then he wanted to quit, and I'd had a really successful meet in 2009 at Rock Springs, Wyoming. I'd signed up for 15 events and actually got asked to do another canoeing, an additional canoeing one than the one Clint and I did. And I ended up with 15 golds and 1 silver. So that was, I thought, okay, if we're going to quit, this has been a successful meet, I can quit on a high. However, I think almost the next year he wanted to do the Ogden 5K, and we kept doing the Ogden 5K. I didn't do it the last 2 years because of knee problems, but he has continued doing it. Mom had a car accident in that time and was in the hospital, had cut her leg badly and needed some help. So Clint and I drove down and stayed with her, got her out of the hospital and stayed with her for several days, and then brought her back up here for a while, and then she flew home. And then in, I'm not quite sure when, maybe about 98 or 99, she moved up here and lived in Harrison Regent, and I would go over there and visit with her and take her on errands and do fun things together and have her back at our home doing fun family things. Then she died in 2006, and we flew back and to the burial at Arlington Cemetery then. And I continued. I started in about 2004 or so volunteering at the Family History Center and in Ogden. And I've continued, so I've been doing that ever since. And I've just gone down for 1 afternoon shift a week. If you go 2 shifts a week, you're a missionary. But then sometimes they don't want you serving in your ward, and I've wanted to continue serving in my ward, so I'm still teaching primary in my ward. And Clint and I had done several missions in that time. When Mom was up here, we were serving a mission at the conference center, and we served a mission in downtown Ogden that was called Daily Dose, where we worked with Hispanic people, trying to help them as they came into the country and into Ogden, learning some English and just basic, going to the store, going to a pharmacy, going to the hospital, basic English vocabulary. But we enjoyed it thoroughly, met wonderful Spanish families, and began teaching some of their children piano, and developed nice ties to some of our Hispanic people in Ogden.
The conference
So
center.
now,
The conference center.
at the conference center, we took tours, and Clint was an assistant supervisor the first year, or they did it as a couple. And so I made up the schedule for which post our staff were supposed to be at and when they switched and so on. We all took turns standing at some of the stations and taking turns taking tours of people. That was a wonderful experience. We loved doing that. Walking on granite is very hard on your feet, so we quickly got shoes with leather soles, not leather. Rubber soles, yeah. And so we did that mission, and we'd already done a stake mission together. So even though I haven't served a full-time mission, I've been able to do those 3 part-time missions. So we lived at home doing those. So now we are retired, and we go to the club every morning and work out for an hour
or an hour and a half, and I generally swim. I was swimming a mile until last year having knee surgery. I'm doing about 3/4 of a mile when I swim. And then every other day I work in the fitness room and bike for 20-25 minutes and walk on a treadmill for about that long and then use the equipment. Clint's going twice a day. He goes back in the afternoons to swim. So we do that in our volunteer work and visit our family when we can.
So at the end of my family history, I kind of wanted to leave my testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ for my descendants. And as I said in the life history, I received my testimony as an answer to prayer when we were living in Camp Lejeune. And the spiritual trials and blessings I've had since have only strengthened it. And but I learned at that time, and since it's been strengthened, that Joseph Smith is a true prophet of God, and that the Church of Jesus Christ is true, and the priesthood authority is held in the church, and I treasure the eternal covenants that I've made under this authority. And I know that God inspires its leaders and each one of us, including me. And none of us is perfect, and so sometimes there are wrong decisions made and wrong results in the church. However, I firmly believe that God is in charge of this world and that right and righteousness will prevail. And I love the scriptures. So many of them have helped me in my life and given me peace or consolation or answers that I've wanted. Sometimes I'm asked for my favorite one, but I think my favorite one is the one that answers that problem or that prayer that particular time. So I continually pray that my family members will draw close to the Lord so that we can be sealed together forever. And I pray that my descendants will appreciate the blessings that come from their own hard work in achieving their own goals. I also recommend serving other people, whether it's family members or neighbors or anyone. More than I think anything you can do, serving others helps you put your life in perspective and your life concerns in perspective, and it will be a blessing in your life. And the end.